nowhere. Met up with coming home. Time come by.
It was 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon in downtown Birmingham when something happened that nobody could have predicted. Traffic on New Street literally came to a standstill, not because of an accident or construction, but because of a voice. A voice so raw, so haunting, so impossibly perfect that drivers were getting out of their cars just to figure out where it was coming from. The voice belonged to Marcus, a kid who looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. 19 years old, wearing clothes that had seen better months, sitting on a piece of cardboard with a beaten-up acoustic guitar that was missing 2 strings. But when Marcus opened his mouth and started singing, "Mama, I'm coming home," something magical happened. Something that defied everything you think you know about talent, training, and where greatness comes from. This wasn't some polished street performer trying to make rent money. This was survival music. Marcus had aged out of the foster care system 8 months earlier with nowhere to go and no family to catch him. The guitar was the only thing he owned that his foster parents hadn't sold, and he'd been living in shelters and doorways ever since, using Ozzy's music as his lifeline to sanity. But here's what made people stop their cars and forget about their appointments. Marcus wasn't just covering Ozzy's song. He was channeling something deeper, something that came from the same place of pain and abandonment that had originally inspired Ozzy to write it. Every note carried the weight of real loss, real longing, real desperation to find home in a world that had never offered him one. The crowd that gathered wasn't your typical street performance audience. These were business people in expensive suits, mothers with strollers, teenagers cutting school, all of them drawn by a voice that seemed to reach into their chests and squeeze their hearts. By the time Marcus hit the chorus, there were actual tears on actual faces of complete strangers who'd never heard this kid's name, but somehow felt like they'd known his story their entire lives. That's when the black SUV pulled up. Marcus was so lost in his performance, so completely absorbed in pouring his pain into Ozzy's lyrics, that he didn't notice the small crowd forming around him had gone completely silent. He didn't see the expensive vehicle double parked in the middle of traffic. He didn't notice the passenger door opening or the figure stepping out onto the sidewalk. But everyone else did, because stepping out of that SUV, moving through the crowd like he was sleepwalking, was Ozzy Osbourne himself. The real Ozzy, the legend, the Prince of Darkness, looking older and frailer than his recent public appearances, but unmistakably him. He'd been riding through Birmingham on his way to a private doctor's appointment when his driver had been forced to stop because of the traffic jam this kid's singing was causing. Ozzy stood at the edge of that crowd for the entire rest of the song, and something incredible happened to his face. The confusion melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. Not recognition of the kid, he'd never seen Marcus before in his life, but recognition of something else. Something in the way Marcus held his pain, the way he transformed suffering into sound, the way he made broken things beautiful. When Marcus finished singing and finally looked up, he found himself staring into the eyes of his musical hero. But instead of excitement or starstruck panic, something else passed between them. Understanding. The kind of recognition that happens when two people who have lived the same kind of pain find each other across impossible odds. The crowd was holding its breath, waiting for autographs or photos or some typical celebrity encounter. But Ozzy didn't ask for Marcus's name or compliment his performance. Instead, he asked the question that would change everything. How long have you been homeless, son? Marcus could have lied, could have tried to save face in front of this crowd and this legend. Instead, he answered with the same brutal honesty that had just poured out of his voice. 8 months, since I turned 18 and couldn't stay in care anymore. That's when Ozzy did something that shocked everyone watching. He sat down on that filthy sidewalk next to Marcus, picked up the broken guitar and said, "Play it again, but this time let me sing with you." What happened next would change both their lives forever. But first, Ozzy needed to hear something in Marcus's voice that was about to unlock a secret from his own past. A secret that would explain why this random street kid's performance felt so eerily, impossibly familiar. When Ozzy sat down on that sidewalk next to Marcus, something extraordinary happened. Not the kind of extraordinary you see in movies, but the kind that only happens when two broken souls recognize each other across impossible circumstances. As they sang together, legend and street kid, millionaire and homeless teenager, something in Marcus's voice made Ozzy's hands start shaking. It wasn't just talent. Ozzy had heard thousands of talented singers over 5 decades in music. This was something else entirely, something that made his chest tighten with a recognition he couldn't quite place. The way Marcus hit certain notes, the way his voice cracked on specific emotional beats, the way he instinctively knew exactly when to harmonize and when to let Ozzy carry the melody. It was like listening to an echo of his own younger self. But here's what really freaked Ozzy out. Marcus had never had a single voice lesson, never studied music theory, never even owned a proper guitar until he found this broken one in a dumpster behind a music store. Everything he knew about singing, about performing, about channeling pain into power, he'd learned by listening to Ozzy's albums on repeat in whatever homeless shelter would let him stay the night. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Ozzy asked when they finished the song. The crowd was still gathered around them, phones recording, but both men seemed completely oblivious to the audience. Marcus looked confused by the question. "I didn't learn it anywhere. I just listened to your records and tried to feel what you were feeling when you sang them." That's when something clicked in Ozzy's mind. Something about the way Marcus talked about music, about using it to survive emotional pain, reminded him of conversations he'd had decades earlier. Conversations with a young woman named Jenny during the chaos of his early solo career. "What's your last name, kid?" Ozzy asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. "Thompson," Marcus replied. "Marcus Thompson. My mom was Jenny Thompson before she died when I was 7. The name hit Ozzy like a physical blow. Jenny Thompson, a backup singer he'd worked with briefly in 1984 during the recording sessions for Bark at the Moon. A sweet girl from Birmingham who'd gotten caught up in the whirlwind of his life during one of his darkest periods. A girl who disappeared from his world as quickly as she'd entered it, right around the time his drinking and drug use had reached levels that erased entire months from his memory. Ozzy's mind was racing, trying to piece together fuzzy memories from 40 years ago. He remembered Jenny's voice, how it had blended perfectly with his during late-night recording sessions. He remembered her talking about wanting to be a mother someday, about hoping to raise kids who would love music the way she did. But the timeline, the dates, the way she'd suddenly stopped showing up to sessions without explanation, it was all starting to make horrifying sense. "Marcus," Ozzy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what year were you born?" 2005, Marcus answered, not understanding why this simple question had made his musical hero look like he'd seen a ghost. The math was devastating. 2005, 40 weeks after those recording sessions ended, 40 weeks after Jenny had stopped coming to the studio. The DNA results came back 72 hours later, and they confirmed what Ozzy's heart had already known the moment he heard Marcus sing. 99.7% probability. This homeless teenager wasn't just some talented street kid who happened to love Ozzy's music. He was Ozzy Osbourne's biological son. But here's what made the revelation absolutely devastating. Marcus had been in the system since he was 7 years old. 7 years old after his mother, Jenny, died from complications related to diabetes, a condition she couldn't afford to treat properly as a single mother with no health insurance. For 12 years, while Ozzy was living in mansions and touring the world, his son was being shuffled between foster homes, group homes, and temporary placements. The foster care records that Sharon's legal team obtained painted a heartbreaking picture. Marcus had been labeled a difficult child because he was obsessed with music and would sing constantly. The exact behavior that made him a natural performer was seen as disruptive in institutional settings. Social workers noted that he showed signs of depression and abandonment issues, never understanding that those same emotional wounds were feeding an incredible artistic gift. "He was right there," Ozzy said during an emergency family meeting, his voice hollow with shock. "He was right there in Birmingham the whole time. While I was playing concerts for 50,000 people, my own son was sleeping in group homes 20 minutes from where I grew up." But the most crushing part was discovering that Marcus had tried to find his father multiple times. At 14, he'd somehow gotten access to a computer at his group home and started researching his mother's musical connections. He'd found photos of Jenny with various bands from the 80s, including several with Ozzy, but Child Services had dismissed his claims as fantasy. A troubled kid making up stories about celebrity connections. At 16, Marcus had actually shown up at one of Ozzy's concerts in Birmingham, hoping to somehow get backstage to tell his story. He'd saved money for months to buy a ticket, practiced what he'd say to security guards, even brought along his mother's old photo as proof. But concert security had treated him like every other obsessed fan with a sob story. He'd been escorted out before he ever got close to making contact. The security footage from that show is still in our archives, Sharon revealed. We went back and found it. There's my stepson standing outside the venue with that photo, getting turned away by our own security team. We were literally 15 feet from each other and had no idea. What made this even more tragic was discovering that Jenny had tried to tell Ozzy about the pregnancy. She'd left multiple messages with his management company in 1984, but they'd been filtered out by assistants who were paid to keep complications away from their client. Jenny's attempts to contact Ozzy had been categorized as fan mail and thrown away without him ever knowing they existed. The paper trail was all there. Hospital records showing Jenny had listed John Osbourne as the father on Marcus's birth certificate, attempted contact logs from the management company, even a letter Jenny had written to Ozzy that was never delivered, found in her belongings after she died and kept by Marcus for 12 years. She never stopped loving him, Marcus said when Sharon showed him the letter. Even after years of no response, even when she was dying, she told me that my father was a good man who just lived in a different world. She made me promise never to hate him for not knowing about me. The weight of this revelation broke something fundamental in Ozzy. This wasn't just about discovering a son he'd never known. This was about realizing that while he'd been struggling with his own demons, creating music about abandonment and family pain, his actual son had been living that nightmare in real life. The irony was crushing. Ozzy's most personal songs about family trauma had been inspired by his own childhood wounds, never knowing he was creating the soundtrack for his son's identical experience. But Ozzy's response to this devastating truth would shock everyone who thought they knew the Prince of Darkness. What Ozzy did next wasn't what anyone expected from a rock legend discovering his long-lost son. He didn't offer money or a place to stay or any of the typical solutions that wealthy people think solve poverty. Instead, he made a promise that would terrify his management team and change the trajectory of his final years. "I'm going to teach you everything I should have taught you for the last 19 years, and then we're going to perform together." This wasn't some publicity stunt or feel-good photo opportunity. Ozzy was talking about bringing an untrained street musician onto the biggest stages in the world during what everyone knew would be his farewell tour. His team thought he'd lost his mind. Record executives reminded him about insurance policies, liability issues, the reputation risks of putting an amateur on stage with a 50-year veteran. Ozzy's response was simple. "This kid has been performing my music better than most professionals for years. He just hasn't had the right stage yet." What followed was the most intensive musical education in rock history. Ozzy moved Marcus into the family home and spent 18 hours a day teaching him everything, not just singing techniques, but stage presence, crowd control, how to handle the pressure of performing for massive audiences. But more importantly, he was teaching Marcus how to be a son and learning how to be a father to someone who'd raised himself. The transformation was incredible. Marcus had raw talent that decades of proper training couldn't create, but he'd never learned how to harness it professionally. Under Ozzy's guidance, his natural abilities exploded into something genuinely spectacular. His voice gained power and control while keeping that emotional authenticity that had stopped traffic in Birmingham. His stage presence evolved from desperate survival mode into confident command. But the real magic happened during their private sessions. Father and son working through 40 years of missed conversations, using music as their common language. Ozzy would share stories about his own abandonment issues, his struggles with addiction, his fears about not being good enough. Marcus would respond with songs, turning their mutual pain into harmonies that made grown men cry. He wasn't just learning to be a performer, Sharon later revealed. He was learning to be Ozzy's son, and Ozzy was learning to be the father he'd never had the chance to become. The announcement that Marcus would join Ozzy's farewell tour sent shockwaves through the music industry. Critics called it nepotism, a desperate attempt to generate headlines. Fans were skeptical about whether some unknown kid could measure up to the legacy of the Prince of Darkness. Vegas odds makers were literally taking bets on whether Marcus would be booed off stage. None of them understood what was about to happen. The first show was in Birmingham, at the same arena where Ozzy had played his first major solo concert 43 years earlier. When father and son walked onto that stage together and launched into "Mama, I'm Coming Home," something unprecedented occurred. 80,000 people, Fans who'd paid hundreds of dollars to see Ozzy's final performances were witnessing the most emotionally powerful duet in rock history. Marcus didn't try to copy his father's style. Instead, he brought his own pain, his own story, his own interpretation to songs that had defined Ozzy's career. When they reached the chorus, when Marcus sang about coming home with that same raw desperation he'd had on the street corner, the entire arena erupted. Not just applause, but actual screaming, crying, emotional release from thousands of people who suddenly understood they were watching something unrepeatable. "I've been to hundreds of concerts," one fan posted online afterward. "I've never seen anything like that moment when you realized you were watching a father and son heal 40 years of separation through music. Everyone in that arena was crying." But the real impact came during the encore. Ozzy stepped back and let Marcus perform solo. A kid who 8 months earlier had been homeless, now commanding a stadium full of metalheads with the same authority as his legendary father. The crowd didn't just accept him. They embraced him as the rightful heir to a musical legacy he'd been unknowingly carrying his entire life. The tour became the most emotionally charged concert experience in rock history. Night after night, father and son performed together, each show deepening their relationship and proving that talent really can transcend circumstances. Marcus evolved from curiosity to sensation to genuine star, not because of his famous father, but because his authenticity was undeniable. "Watching them together changed how I think about family," one longtime fan said. "About second chances, about how sometimes the most broken stories create the most beautiful endings." The final show of the tour at Madison Square Garden became a celebration of everything Ozzy had accomplished in his career, but also a passing of the torch to someone who'd earned it through surviving everything Ozzy himself had endured. When they sang, "Mama, I'm Coming Home," for the last time together on stage, both men were crying, the crowd was crying, and somewhere in Birmingham, a street corner that had once housed a homeless teenager had become holy ground. Marcus wasn't just inheriting his father's musical legacy. He was proving that no matter how broken your beginning, no matter how many people overlook your potential, no matter how impossible your dreams seem, sometimes the universe conspires to give you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it most. Ozzy had spent his career singing about darkness and redemption. In his final act, he'd lived it. If this story of music's power to heal impossible wounds moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Sometimes the most broken beginnings create the most beautiful endings. Subscribe for more incredible stories of legends discovering that family isn't just blood. It's recognition, love, and the courage to start over together.